All right, she is a women's rights activist, a feminist blogger, and advocate against gender violence. She co-founded Utah for Congo to raise awareness for post-rape survivors and is currently heavily involved in the Mormon feminist movement. She is an assistant director for the Sunstone Education Foundation and the founder of the Feminist Mormon Housewives podcast. She blogs for feministmormonhousewives.org about women's issues. Her work has been referenced by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, Quartz Magazine, and many other publications. She and her family live in Salt Lake, where she raises 3 beautiful kiddos, gardens, and rages against the machine. Everybody welcome up Lindsay Hansen Park.
Hello. Nice to see familiar faces here. Just as a background, just so I can know my audience a little bit, who does not have a background in Mormonism? Okay.
I'm way out of town too. So.
Do you know anything about Mormonism at all?
Yeah, my wife's on.
Okay, fantastic. All right, second question. How many people have not listened to the Year of Polygamy podcast? You won't hurt my feelings, raise your hand. Okay, so as a background, not mentioned in my bio, I started a project called the Year of Polygamy podcast. I feel like I should mention that I'm not a polygamist. Never been a polygamist, do not intend to be a polygamist. Not that there's anything wrong with that, it's just not what I do. So I grew up in the LDS group, the LDS church, and the Mormon church, and was really bothered by the idea of polygamy. For those who know, in the LDS context, we don't practice polygamy now, but we are supposed to practice it in the heavens, and that really, really bothered me. And so I started this project, which was exploring the idea of Mormon plural marriage from the beginning until now. And for those who have listened to the podcast, you know that when I start out, I have this sort of like very sweet, naive promise that I make everyone at the beginning, where I'm like, it's gonna be okay, you guys, we're gonna get through it, and we're gonna listen, and you're gonna all feel better. And I think it's about episode 36, 37, 38, where I'm like, what have I done? I'm so sorry. Because the podcast is really my process as, thinking that I knew a lot about Joseph Smith's wives. Felt like that was all you need to know about the subject. And as we get into the Utah period and we learn about sort of how polygamy is practiced in Utah, my mind was like exploding. And then that brought me into contact with Mormon Fundamentalism, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. So again, with my background, I come from the LDS tradition. I'm not a Mormon Fundamentalist, but I do have affection for Mormon Fundamentalists. And so why would this topic be relevant to any of you? You're from out of town. Is there anyone else that does not live in Utah? Okay. So I would say that this is an important topic that all Utahns need to be literate on. Not because Mormon fundamentalists are dangerous particularly. There are some dangerous, in my opinion, dangerous Mormon fundamentalists. But because we live and interact with these groups on a daily basis, probably more than we're aware of. In fact, I make some crazy claims, and one of them is that all of you know Mormon polygamists. You just might not know that you know Mormon polygamists. Some of you might know that you know Mormon polygamists. Raise your hand if you know or have a relationship with currently practicing polygamists. Okay. I would say everyone that didn't raise your hands, you probably could raise your hands because Mormon polygamy is everywhere. And you know what? I used to leave Utah and people would make jokes about polygamy and I'd be like, ha ha ha, you don't know anything, we don't do that anymore. But actually, they're right. Utah polygamy is a huge, huge thing. It's being practiced everywhere, and what a lot of people don't know is Mormon polygamy has really inspired the Christian polygamy movement. A lot of popular Christian polygamists get their inspiration from Mormon polygamists, and they've met with them, and they've been inspired by them. And so within Mormonism alone, there are, John Hamer estimates there are about 400 extant groups of Mormonism that we can track that are not independent. This means actual organized groups that have broken off from the Restoration movement, 400. Now Utah is home to most of these, but a lot of them also exist outside of Utah. I'm going to focus on the ones that are organized in Utah today, just to kind of give us a primer on this, and then we can talk about it. So just as I'm just going to go over the history of how this happened, because growing up LDS, I was taught that people in these polygamous groups were weird and strange and odd and misguided. And it's been a really a beneficial thing for me to see my own Mormonism as an outsider, if that makes sense. So I've looked at them and judged them as an outsider. Now that I've interacted with them and seen how very, very similar we are, I've been able to see how other people have seen my group for so long, the LDS Church for so long. But I think that what we need to understand about these groups is that they are exactly like us in our thoughts and our capabilities and our thinking. They just grew up in different families. And so these people come by these beliefs honestly. It's not like there are these, with the exception of, in my opinion, a few strange individuals, most of these people have a really good reason to believe what they believe. So that's what the history tells us. So, okay, we know that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Secretly, it came across the plains, 1852, Brigham Young starts speaking about it openly. They actually go on a PR campaign and send Orson Pratt to Washington, D.C., because they believe, like, if people just understood what we're doing, they're all going to be converted to the practice. That didn't go so well. But it actually led to half of the saints in Britain who were being converted to apostatizing, because they're like, wait a minute, this is not what we signed up for. But a lot of people did sign up and came over. They practiced polygamy. Polygamy is thriving in the 1860s. Most of the plural marriages on the frontier happened in 2 years during the Mormon Reformation. And then, of course, the U.S. government starts to really use polygamy to crack down on the Mormon Church. And in the 1870s and 1880s, that's where a lot of the men go underground. That's where you see the striped pajamas and the guys hiding out, and families sort of split up. Now, we start here with Utah becoming a state because Utah becomes a state in 1896. Brigham Young had been trying to apply for statehood for a long time, but one of the things, the main thing that prevented them from doing that was this practice of plural marriage. They had to give it up. Now there's, of course, we cover this on the podcast, there's this huge history behind all of this, including women's suffrage. A lot of people don't realize that the right to vote for women was brought about by Mormon polygamy. It was Mormon polygamous women who the U.S. government thought if we gave them the right to vote, then they would vote themselves out of this barbaric practice. So they give women the right to vote. Mormon women don't vote the way that they want, so they take the vote away, and then they give it back eventually. But a lot of Mormon women polygamists were activists for the vote. So 1890, the church finally decides that they're going to say, nope, we're not doing polygamy again, right? It's not until 1896 that they start to get some federal trust. We have Reed Smoot, who is a Mormon. He is not a polygamist, but he goes there and he is treated in a terrible way by the U.S. government, discriminated against. This kind of gives Mormons this persecution complex. Now, we have 1904. A lot of people don't talk about the Second Manifesto. A lot of people know in 1890 the church said no more polygamy, right? But what they didn't know is that even their own prophet, Wilford Woodruff, was marrying people in 1896, plurally. And a lot of these people were still living and practicing and marrying people. In fact, in the church Quorum of the 12 and then in the leadership structure, men were sanctioning marriages while other apostles were excommunicating people who had been married by the sanctions. So Joseph F. Smith finally says, you know, we have to really end this because we could lose our statehood, we could lose all the things that we worked so hard for, and he has the Second Manifesto. Joseph F. Smith is issuing the Second Manifesto while still winking and nodding and allowing some marriages to happen. So, of course, a lot of people don't trust this. Now, this is where the rise of fundamentalism comes from. Lawrence C. Woolley sort of comes out of nowhere. Now, John W. Woolley was his father, and he was a bodyguard to John Taylor, which is a former LDS prophet. Now, John Taylor was the prophet who never gave up polygamy. Right after him is where the church backs away from polygamy. But John Taylor was on the run in the 1870s and 1880s. He actually, a lot of the homes downtown, they still have some existing homes, have secret passages and hidden stairways and stuff for these polygamists to hide when the government would come. And John Taylor actually, he lived in the Gardo House, which was one of the biggest mansions in the West. It's been torn down. But in the Gardo House, there were trap doors and there were secret passages, and that's where John Taylor would hide. There's a story of him actually like hiding in a crawl space when the federal government came. So John Taylor was like this hero he's still the hero of Mormon fundamentalism. He was kind of like, you know, on the run, giving the middle finger to the government, saying, I'm never going to give up this practice. It's never going to be taken from the earth. And so then, of course, when he is preceded by Wilford Woodruff, who says, oh, sorry, it is going to be taken from the earth. Nobody believes Wilford Woodruff, first of all. And second of all, you have people like John W. Woolley who say, I was there outside his door when John Taylor had this spectacular vision. He was met by the Godhead, he was met by Joseph Smith, and he told John Taylor that I should be ordained to keep the practice of plural marriage alive. Now that's not a crazy story. This is one of the 1886 revelations. There's a few of these. This is in John Taylor's own hand, and the LDS Church has access to this. There's a struggle within Mormon fundamentalism that the LDS Church has these revelations. It's been verified to be in John Taylor's own hands, but the LDS Church has kept those hidden. So there's, in the same way that sort of ex-Mormons think that the LDS Church is hiding history, Mormon fundamentalists believe so on an extreme level. So a lot of the 1886 revelations are kept hidden because the thinking goes that if these things come out, then a lot of Latter-day Saints, LDS church members will say, well, wait a minute, are we still supposed to be practicing plural marriage? And Mormon fundamentalists would say, yes, you are. So John Woolley, he is sort of believing that he's keeping those keys alive. His son Lauren holds on to this revelation for about 20 years, which is why the LDS Church sort of says we can't take it seriously because he waited 20 years to do this. Basically, long story short, they start to congregate down in southern Utah. Now, Mormons, what we don't understand about polygamy when we talk about it is in 1890, your family would have still been practicing polygamy. And just because the church says it's not happening doesn't mean it's not happening, right? So you are still living polygamy even though the church has made a statement now. And what happens to those families? I think in our minds we just kind of think that they just disappear or something, but they don't. They're still living plural marriage. And after a while, there was a time in the LDS Church, in the Mormon Church, where if you were a polygamist, it was a sign of status, right? The elite, the prophets had the most wives. But about in the 1880s and 1890s, it started to become a thing of shame. Popular culture starts to come in with the railroad and with the telegraph and things like that. And so now it's not so cool to be a polygamist, and so you have to hide it. So we have women hiding their pregnancies if they're a plural wife and things like that. And so by this time, they're starting to feel ostracized by their own members of the LDS Church. In fact, there was a large group practicing plural marriage in Mexico. They were seen as some of the elite, the top order of the Celestial Kingdom Mormons. They have to leave Mexico because of political unrest in Mexico. They arrive in Salt Lake City and they are shunned by their members. There are stories of them going to sit in church and everyone's scooting down the row so they're not sitting by their family members. There's a complete change of pace for the tone of plural marriage. So they all start congregating in southern Utah. And this is where we see John White Barlow. He, along with the Woolley family, they decide that maybe the church is starting to be a little bit lost in this, just like John Taylor said it would, and that they have to keep this practice alive. And we really believe that they have the authority to do this. And when you have documentary history like John Taylor's own revelation, that gives you a pretty good argument. They start what they call the Council, the Council of Friends, where it was this idea that the LDS Church has the keys of the priesthood to keep the lights on, to do missionary work, to do the business end of things, to do the publications, to print the Book of Mormons for people, but they were entrusted with the keys to do sealings. So it was sort of this group, this council, this priesthood council that they believed is how Joseph Smith used to run things, and there's a good argument that Joseph Smith had a government structure like this. They in about the 1920s and 30s, LDS Church gets wind of this, that they're still practicing, including 2 of their own apostles. So they decide to start excommunicating everybody, and that's when this group starts to form in Colorado City. They sort of move to Colorado City, Arizona, and Hilldale. It's isolated. They want to be left alone, and they're left alone mostly until the 1940s and 1950s, where they have all of these raids. The U.S. government comes in, and what in a really ironic twist of fate, the U.S. government comes in 1953. Now, has anyone been to Colorado City? So when you go there, it's like this little valley protected by this like fortress of red rocks, right? And they made it that way. And if you go up there in Colorado City, they have caves where they've carved in bathrooms, plumbing, all kinds of things where the men would live and watch for the U.S. government. And the story goes that the men that were standing watch on these rocks got wind of, they could see the cars from the Arizona side, this is in 1953, coming down the road in the early morning hours. And so they sent a dynamite signal to the town. The town gets everybody up, gets all their kids around, and they start a prayer circle. So when the U.S. government comes to raid the town for practicing polygamy, they're all praying. So the pictures that we get from the news are these sweet little families praying, children crying, leaving their parents, and the nation, for the first time in history, goes crazy because they say, oh my goodness, why would you tear up these families? So for the first time in history, the U.S. government has done something that the rest of the American people say, wait a minute, be nice to these polygamists. But the only people that were supporting the raid was the Deseret News. So it's super ironic that the LDS Church now is on the opposite side, being the oppressor. So I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to go through these really quick. So out of this comes a bunch of splits. Since the LDS Church has an issue with authority, we don't have a really good way to pass on authority. We think that we do, but clearly we don't with our 400 extant groups. We have issues to authority, and there are legitimate claims to authority. This is the most popular one, the FLDS. Whenever I talk about fundamentalists, everybody thinks I'm talking about this group. This is one of the larger groups, but it's not the only group, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. Current prophet is Warren Jeffs. He's in prison. There's about over 10,000 members, and they are everywhere. And you will recognize them by the straight pastel dresses, just the plain pastel dresses. Centennial Park is another very popular group. They broke away from the FLDS in the 1980s. They have about 5,000 members. They're going through a real faith crisis in their group right now because there's some sexual abuse allegations with their current leader. And they look a lot like FLDS. They have the fishtail braids and things like that, but they dress, as you can see, a little bit more diverse. The Blackmore group, this is someone that I know, this is me and Winston Blackmore. He was excommunicated in 2000 from Warren Jeffs. He lives up in Canada, but he is gaining more and more followers. As people leave the FLDS church, they're following him. This is Winston with his daughters. Okay, perfect. Good to know. Thanks. So Winston, he was set to take over for the FLDS. Warren Jeffs threw him out in sort of a power struggle. And so Winston is up in Canada. He has been charged with polygamy and will probably face a trial. The date for his trial has not been set. This is the Kingston group, the Latter-day Church of Christ. This is the one that I try to bring awareness to because they are very prevalent in Utah County. They started out as a united order. They also come from this Council of Friends in sort of a strange way, but they own so many businesses in Utah that you wouldn't believe. Washiki Renewable Energy, they sponsor the Utah Jazz. Standard supply, restaurant supply, just about every pawn shop you can think of. A lot of sort of mobster businesses, I guess, like ice shops and coin and laundry shops and food supply, restaurant supply. There's too many to count, but they are basically, you support Kingston businesses and you support the Kingston family. Now the problem with the Kingstons, the big criticism that I have is that they have what I would say is criminal incest in the family. So because of their Kingston line, the Kingston blood is considered somehow special, and so it's important for people to have ties with Kingston blood in their DNA. And this has led to a lot of birth defects and stillborns and things like that. Now Kingstons look normal for the most part, just like you and I. You can go, South Salt Lake is predominantly owned by Kingston businesses, Kingston Holdings. They have a lot of real estate businesses. They try to fly under the radar, but they actually believe that they are living the United Order, and the dangerous thinking is that they believe that they will go to war against all of us someday. So there are rumors of stockpiling weapons and sort of this idea of they can't trust outsiders. So many of you probably know Kingston members. You probably went to school with some of them, but and they don't all have a Kingston last name. They changed their names so they will not be recognized. Christopher Nemelka's group. Do we have anybody from his group here today? They usually like to come to my person. Christopher Nemelka is no longer practicing plural marriage as far as I'm aware. He believes he is Hiram Smith reincarnated. He was a security guard, I think, for the Salt Lake Temple. He translated the sealed portion of the golden plates, and they call him like the polygamy Fabio. I actually did hear that he's working at Walmart in Sandy right now. This idea of being a humble servant. Ida Smith is a great-great-granddaughter of Hiram Smith, and she was LDS, very, very much connected to the LDS church hierarchy. It was sort of her family lore that the church would someday translate the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. And so when she stumbled upon Nemelka, it seemed like an answer to her prayers. She became a very devout follower of hers, turned over all of her money to him. And in 2010, when she passed away, she willed her family plot in the Hiram Smith family plot in the cemetery to Christopher Nemelka, which he erected this big, like, ostentatious headstone with his URL on it, and on their family plot. And their family tried to sue to get it back. It was this big, ugly thing, but Christopher, you can go see it. Christopher Nemelka's advertisement is on her headstone. This is another group. This is the Mennonite group, the TLC. I get confused because Sister Wives is on TLC. This is TLC, the True and Living Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Jim Harmston started it. He has passed away. He believed he was Joseph Smith reincarnated. They believe in multiple mortal probations, which is a fundamentalist doctrine. So he believes he is Joseph Smith. They've had a lot of sexual abuse allegations. They do a lot of prayer circles. That's actually how he believed he was restored. This is why the LDS Church really cracks down on firesides, because in the 1990s, Harmston was doing these firesides. It led to a bunch of fundamentalist offshoots from people meeting in their homes and trying to learn the deeper truths of Mormonism and sort of starting their own religions. This is an independent group. I just think it's interesting. This is a Rockland Ranch. Has anyone been there? Yeah, so this is a group of a few families that they have carved out their homes in the rocks. And by all accounts, so Bob Foster was the leader. He's passed away, but it's mostly his kids. They're independent, polygamous, and by all accounts, as far as I can tell, they're happy, good, well-adjusted people, kind of people. Just, they garden in their co-op and live their lives. This is a Nielsen Naylor group. A lot of my contacts come from this. They split from Centennial Park. They're known as the Third Ward, and Ivan Nelson, who was one of the founders, he's seen as sort of one of the grandfathers of Mormon fundamentalism. He and Ogden Kraut are some of the best theologians that Mormon fundamentalism has. They do a lot of writing. Ivan Nelson is known for being sort of the steward of the theology and the doctrine. And so their group is all over. Some of them are in like Roosevelt and Vernal area. and in Salt Lake and all over. This is probably the most well-known one, the AUB or the Allred group. They come from the Apostolic United Brethren. This is who Cody Brown and Sister Wives are from. They have a lot of people. They blend in. They go to your churches. They go to your schools. They send their kids on missions. Their kids are at BYU. They are also having a faith crisis issue with Lynn Thompson was accused of molesting his daughters. And so they have a group up in Montana called Pinesdale, Montana, where they're having a big split, a leadership crisis, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with them. You'll notice that the women wear long sleeves to cover their garments. All of these groups have different iterations of garments, just like the LDS group. Oh, this is me looking like a plural wife standing with Cody Brown and his 5 wives. They were part of the AUB. They all left because he converted to feminism, and they became Buddhists, and they still practice their own marriage. They're great. This is the Peterson group. We actually had missionaries come to Sunstone from the Peterson group. So this is the first time I was in contact with actual members of the Peterson group. They're famous for their little pyramid temple. They broke off from the AUB after Rulon Allred was murdered. And, I was going to go back to that. So their prophet, Rulon Allred, was murdered by another polygamous leader, the LeBaron group, which I'm not going to talk about today. But basically, a group down in Mexico became really cult-like and dangerous and violent. They put out a hit list for those who challenged Ervil LeBaron's or his brother's authority. And so they sort of trained their members to kill, and Spencer W. Kimball was on the hit list. But they were able to go into their prophet, Rulon Allred's dental practice in Murray and gun him down. And it was sort of that was in the 70s, it was a big deal. It brought sort of all the groups together for the first time. But when he died, this man, Gerald Peterson, believed that he got the keys in a vision, and it was compelling enough that they moved to the desert and started their own little co-op. Now, what's interesting about them is most fundamentalists believe that the Mormon Church became corrupt when we allowed black people into the temple. And so that was in 1978 when they lifted the ban on the temple and the priesthood. And that's when most fundamentalists said, they've gone too far, it's too far. So they started building their own temples. Well, what's interesting about this is 2 months before that revelation came through, they built their temple. And Gerald Peterson used that to say, I had discerned that the church was going to be corrupt. And we found out, because we took the missionaries to dinner, that they don't eat pork. This is some of their doctrines that they gave me. The grease stains are not my own. They came to me that way. But they're very sweet and very, very poor. So those are just some of the groups. The last thing I was going to say is, I know I'm like skipping around a lot, so I don't even know if that makes sense to you. We do, I think one of the things that's really important about working with all of these groups is integration. Since we all come from a shared history, the LDS Church is actually not different in theology and belief, and in practice in a lot of ways. And so my goal with these groups is integration, seeing each other as people. And so we go down to Colorado City twice a year to do service projects. This was us in front of this house. We cleaned the carpet, ripped out a bunch of flooring, and helped some of the helpers restore the home. So anyway, I would encourage you guys to get involved, to not be afraid to talk about this, because if we do not talk about it, we have dangerous practices. That's part of why the Kingston group, the order, is allowed to do some abusive things to their groups, to their adherents, because it's secretive. So I'm just worried about time. You good?
We're good.
Do you guys want to do questions? I don't feel like we went anywhere with that. Go ahead. Questions? Does that make sense to you? Yeah.
Do you know much about the polygamous groups in Wyoming?
Yeah. So there are. Yeah. Which group?
Restate the question.
So I grew up in North Wyoming up by Lovell, and when I was growing up, there was a group up there, and I don't know anything about them.
Do you know what they dress like? they're likely AUB, but this is the thing I was going to say about these groups. So Mormon doctrine is very compelling. Gosh, I'm going to regret this later, but it's sort of like a virus. And it spreads like that. There become different strains of it. And so when you see this, there's, for example, there's a current group it's a Christian polygamous group in Canada, and I can't recall the name. We actually helped one of the women escape from that group. They were influenced by Winston Blackmore's group up in Canada, and they sort of took their own Christian take on it, but with Mormon ties. So I would say it's most likely AUB, if it's in Lovell, Wyoming. But Mormon fundamentalism exists everywhere that Mormonism does, so it's everywhere. So it's all around the world. There's just different strains of it, and it's hard to know. Next question. Someone.
A couple of nights ago on Thursday, a community after leaving Mormonism meeting right near here, on the other side of the university, had the 3 Peterson group missionaries showed up. Anyway,
Yeah, those are my guys.
They kind of tried to proselyte to the group, I heard.
Yeah. So that is a new development as far as I'm aware. So Ryan Hales has this thing about, he's a researcher. He says, and he's a very active, devout LDS man. He says, we can't call them Mormon fundamentalists. There's this huge debate between, are they fundamentalist Mormons or Mormon fundamentalists? They identify as Mormon fundamentalists, so that is the term that I call them. But Brian Hales says that they are not Mormon fundamentalists because they don't do some of the basic tenets of Mormonism. One of those is missionary work. So to see these missionaries come out is kind of exciting to me, and they're proselytizing. It's been around 3 years that they've been doing it. I would say if they come around, feed them dinner. Those poor boys are hungry. Don't feed them pork, but they will eat pork if you feed it to them. They come from a really very, very rural, very close community. But here's the other thing as I told my husband, he learned the hard way, I was like, don't ever, ever, ever argue Mormon doctrine with a Mormon fundamentalist. You won't win. You won't win. Don't try to convert them. I would say the idea is just to let them into your home, hear their message like you would with the LDS people, but let them experience that maybe the outside world isn't so bad. And so that's why I think it's a positive thing to see that these boys are doing this. It was probably 2 young boys and an older gentleman. Is that right?
It was, yes.
The older gentleman's a little harder to take sometimes. He's very sweet. Okay, next question.
When did you start researching?
Probably about 10 years ago. Yeah, I really started getting into the research though in the last 5 years.
What group is the most common around here in
In Orem, the AUB. So the sister wives group. So there's this interesting thing that's happening right now with, the new November policy prohibiting LGBT couples from baptizing their kids. The LDS Church said that they based this on a polygamous policy, which is true. But what's interesting is there are a lot of AUB people that send their kids to Mormon Church, LDS Church, and send them on LDS missions. And what I didn't realize about Brady and I were just talking about this, we were just in Seattle together. His son just got home from his LDS mission, and he actually got permission to let his son go on a mission. He got permission from the Mormon 12, which is interesting. So they didn't talk about it on the show. They did a show called My 5 Wives. But Brady said that his son had to go to the church headquarters, sit in a meeting, be interviewed by like 3 apostles, and then they called Brady and asked him to do, to see if he was sincere about not converting anybody. But what I think is especially interesting is when LDS missionaries are set apart, they have to be with a chaperone, like a Melchizedek priesthood holder, is that correct? Brady got to stand in as a Melchizedek priesthood holder for his son, which I think is interesting. So, anyway.
I live in Eagle Mountain, and there's lots of religions up there. Are they different? It seems like there's different
common, and thousands and thousands and thousands. So there are a lot of independent groups, which mean they don't really have a prophet. They follow fundamentalist teachings, fundamentalist doctrine, but they don't necessarily follow a prophet or go to a church. They might go to LDS church, they might attend AUB or something like that. In Eagle Mountain, there's a lot of AUB, but there's also a lot of independents, and there's a lot of the, what's Tom Green's group? Tom Green is now independent. But anyway, there's a lot of people practice plural marriage, but don't adhere to a dogma, and they see that as the true way, as they would have seen Joseph Smith try to institute, if that makes sense.
I'm a social worker here in Utah County, and I've worked with a lot of groups, West Mountain, Eagle Mountain, and in towns south of San Juan. They're all family interrelated, a lot of Jessop's. So I know a lot of the families, and it's just been interesting. A lot of us in the social work group call them PCPs, plain clothes players, because they blend in so well. They're not in things.
Yeah, that's PCP. I like that term. So in the LDS Church and in Utah, we have a hierarchy of names, right? Like if you know someone who has the last name Kimball or Eyring or McConkey, everyone goes, ooh, a McConkey. It's the same thing as in Mormon Fundamentalism, and there are some very specific names. Of course, Mormon Fundamentalism is very diverse, but there are some names. You can know Mormon Fundamentalists by last names of Jessup and Barlow and Zitting. Jeffs is kind of a new one. I mean, it's the most popular one because of Warren Jeffs, but Jeffs is not an old family name. Musser, if you have Musser in your name, you're related to one of the founding fathers of Mormon Fundamentalism. It's kind of a big deal. So it's interesting that we both do that in our different groups.
I was going to ask, I heard on MSN or something where Warren Jeffs said that none of the husbands could have sex with their wives because basically one of the apostles has to get all the women pregnant or something like that. Is that a common thing among a lot of these groups, or is it just Warren Jeffs that kind of instituted that?
Yeah, so I could spend 3 hours talking about the FLDS just because it's so fascinating. So it is not, I would say, to answer, it's not common, no. So one of the biggest misunderstandings about Mormon fundamentalism is before Warren Jeffs, they were pretty mainstream in practice, very much like an LDS ward, conservative in their dress, but just because they believe that you don't give up principles for certain things. And so if you go down to Short Creek, which are the towns of Colorado City and Hilldale, most people who, prior to 20 years ago, have great memories of the town. It was like, and I'm telling you, like, I love these people and I get it. So it was like your perfect American Western small town. I mean, they had their harvest festival, everyone from the town comes. They remember all their mothers making pies and just glorious, beautiful memories, glorious, beautiful childhoods. When Warren Jeffs takes over from his dad, there is evidence to suggest that Rulon never wanted Warren to take over. Warren sort of co-opts it when his dad's sick. He claims to be his father reincarnated. It's a really interesting way in how he gets authority. But once Warren takes over, things get really crazy really fast. Warren is the one that instituted the prairie dresses. So before, they would have probably looked like, let me show you this. Like this. This is what the FLDS would probably be dressed like today if they were not with Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs is the one that instituted the prairie dress. He changed their word of wisdom. He continues to change their word of wisdom. He started asking, he banned all the toys in town. He said if kids want to play, you have to put a shovel in their hands. Since he's been in prison, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. So they believed that the millennium was coming with the Olympics. When that didn't happen, they cracked down and had even more strict rules. And so since Warren has been in prison, the latest thing that he did, and we were actually trying to get the press to talk about this because they couldn't verify it, and it's the seed bearer thing which we were talking about. So what Warren has done is he has annulled all the marriages. Now, if you're a polygamist, your marriage has to be sanctioned by the prophet. So if the prophet annuls all the marriages, that means all marriages are gone, and that means men and women are not allowed to have sex. So what they've done is they have separated the men and the women, and now if you were to go down to Colorado City with the faithful FLDS, it's likely that the women that are taking care of the children, those are not the children that they gave birth to. Warren has split up all the families, so most women are living with kids that are not their own. The kids are not living with their siblings. Everybody's sort of mixed around. And women live in women's housing and men live in men's housing. And they have certain degrees of righteousness. Just to make it easy, I say that there are two, the United Order group and the Repentance group. The Repentance group are people that Warren is punishing for some reason, and the United Order are people that are the most righteous. There's about 11 levels of those. But some of the highest tier of the United Order are allowed to interact. The sexes are allowed to interact. So if you go to like a Costco in St. George and you see women with a man there, that's their male chaperone. He's not allowed to talk to some of the women there. And I would say, people say, I talk to the women and they're friendly. I would say if you're a man, you could get the women in trouble for talking to them if the chaperone sees. So maybe just like wave. Don't try to reach out to them. So men and women cannot be together, but the doctrine of multiply and replenish the earth still stands. So Warren has decided that to reconcile this, what he was doing is he was having, in the endowment house down there, he was having the seed bearers. He ordained his 15 members in his quorum as seed bearers, and they were allowed to impregnate the women. The women would be on a table and be impregnated, and sometimes if their husband was righteous enough, he was allowed to stand by as a witness and hold her hand. And so that is being investigated now, and we've been trying to get the press to talk about it for a long time. We couldn't find proof, but one of Warren's wives who have left testified in a public trial, so it's on record, and now it's being investigated, and they're doing some DNA evidence and things like that. So.
One more question. One, are you still LDS? And second, if you're to combine the numbers of all of those groups, I know you can't do it accurately, but ballpark about how many people would be involved?
Let me answer that one first. Ann Wild, who is a polygamy proponent, she goes around to she's a polygamist. She would estimate there's about 33,000 Mormon fundamentalists. I think that is ridiculously low. I think it's hard to know. There's a lot of human trafficking involved, especially in the FLDS group. So there's a lot of undocumented people in Mexico who don't have birth certificates, who are just flying completely under the radar. So they're just wild estimates. There is one group that claims to have over 100,000 followers, which is absurd. But I think it's probably more around 50,000. And yes, I am still LDS, although I'm not practicing in the traditional way.
If they're walking among us, so to speak, and you think integration is the best way, how do you do that if you don't even know those around us that might be?
I think the first step is education. So learning about these groups and the challenges that they face is important. So, for example, I have become good friends with Winston and his family. And this is a problem because Winston has been accused of doing some things that, like, especially myself as a feminist and a women's rights advocate, like, is horrific. But it's really forcing me to challenge sort of my own beliefs. But there are people like this, like Winston, who the modern age is forcing him to sort of modernize, right? And so because of this, his daughters are now all being educated. Winston is technically not doing underage marriages, and I say technically not because the age of consent in Canada is like 16 or something, so he's really following the law there. But I would say that you need to educate yourself because each group has their own different challenges. So like with the Kingston, the Order group, they are going to, especially as a social worker, you're going to see different things in different ways that they act. I've talked to law enforcement who have dealt with a lot of child deaths, child abuse cases. One example is there were a lot of seatbelt deaths this last year from car accidents, and the 4 that made the news were all Kingston Order families. But when the news reports it, it's just a seatbelt death, and they don't realize that it's all tied into this group, right? And so when you educate yourself and realize that specific groups have specific problems, then you can kind of know how to address it. Because like I said, if you were to talk to faithful FLDS women, or give them food, or we ran into this, we were smuggling food into Colorado City, and we realized that if they were caught eating our food, they could lose their family. So it's really tricky. I wish I had like a simple answer for you. The way that we're doing it is going into fundamentalist hotspots and sort of integrating and partnering with them, not trying to rescue them. Certainly rescuing needs to be done. Holding Out Help does the rescue operations, and they do a really great job with that. But our goal is to sort of just meet them as partners, and for us to see that they're not bad people, and for them to see we're not bad people too, if that makes sense.
One last question.
Okay, I'm 50 years old, left the church about 3 months ago, LDS Church. Had doubts for a few years to be very faithful. And in April, I see this video on YouTube by interviewing Kyrie Glenn called Mormon Stories. Well, that must be faithful and uplifting, so I watched that, and it wasn't uplifting. And that opened the floodgates, and all this information, I devoured 3-4 hours a day of those stories, and started reading books, and that caused me to leave the church. That pushed me on the edge. Is that happening with these polygamist groups? I mean, is internet information age causing their numbers to shrink, or are they still growing?
Oh, no. So they are going through the exact same thing that like Mormonism in general. So I keep saying the LDS group because Mormonism means all of us, all of these groups, right? The LDS Church have been trying to trademark the term Mormon forever, and they can't do it. And so if you like run a Mormon thing and they send you a letter to say you like, don't worry about it. Just kidding, I would worry about it, but you don't need to worry about it. It's hardly ever successful. But Mormonism is going through this